Welcome back, AP Biology. This time we're talking about chapter 10.1 and 10.2 as we dive into our other form of cell division, meiosis. So starting off, we need to understand the difference between asexual and sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction, as we're familiar with as humans who are the product of it, comes when a sperm-bearing parent and an egg-bearing parent combine their genetic material. So sperm and egg match. They're going to fertilize, resulting in a zygote. That zygote is then going to start to divide through mitosis to develop an embryo, fetus, and eventually be born as a baby. This is an incredible route for creating genetic variation in a population because your offspring are not going to be clones or exact copies genetically, but is going to be a mixture or a fusion of two different individuals. This allows for the possibility of new rearrangements of genes. It creates more genetic diversity, and as a result, a healthier population because more genetic diversity means we can respond better to problems in our ecosystem. Asexual reproduction is going to be more akin to what we saw with mitosis or binary fission, where one cell is going to copy its DNA and divide, and you'll end up with two genetically identical cells. Now, how can asexual reproduction lead to genetic variation? Well, you're going to be reliant on mutations. So, for example, bacteria, when they divide, there could be some mutations in the copying of that DNA that's going to result in some slight variations between the two offspring, which can result in more genetic variation. Additionally, with single-celled organisms, we've talked about things where bacteria can exchange genetic material using plasmids, things like conjugation, where they pass it back and forth, transformation, where they pick it up themselves. So there's other routes for increasing genetic variation in a population. But we're going to be focusing on sexual reproduction with meiosis because if you took one of your cells with all its DNA and one of someone else's cells with all of its DNA and merged them, you would end up with too much DNA. You'd have double the amount of DNA. So we need a process that's going to half the amount of DNA so that when we fuse, we have an entire set. So this is where these chromosomes are going to come into play. And I want to talk about a couple basics of genetics because meiosis is going to be our base point for understanding how genetics works. So know that a gene is a unit of DNA within your genetic code that codes for a specific polypeptide chain or a protein. A trait is the expressed form of a gene, so what we can actually see. And an allele is a different form of a gene. So each gene will have different forms that could result in different traits. We're going to express, because you have pairs of chromosomes, you're always going to have two alleles for every gene. And those are expressed as either uppercase or lowercase alleles for whether they're dominant or recessive. So in an example here, with flower color, so you have a gene that produces a protein that is going to create flower color or the trait. You may have one allele that produces purple flowers and another allele on the same gene that produces white flowers. And so depending on which allele of the gene you inherit will determine which trait you actually express. It's important to note that these are the exact same gene. It's just that some of the letters in that gene might be a little bit different. And so that protein is going to be a little bit different. And as a result, have a different outcome or a different trait. All right, let's dive into chapter 10.2. So what is a chromosome? Well, your DNA spends most of its time as a big bowl of noodles in your nucleus called chromatin. Now, this chromatin is not just loose DNA, but this is DNA that has been wrapped around histone proteins, which are basically little beads that DNA can wrap around to become very condensed. These beads will relax when certain genes need to be expressed, and then they'll tighten back up when genes are not being expressed. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to share a bowl of ramen with somebody, but it can get really messy if you're trying to dump out noodles in a bowl. So when we are dividing, we need to package our DNA even more, condense it even more into the form of chromosomes. So we're going to have a chromosome here, and then when it copies itself, we have these two chromosomes that are going to be bound together by something called a centromere. So chromatin is when we're in interphase, and then as we enter prophase, this chromatin will condense even further into our chromosomes. So your body has 23 pairs of chromosomes, so 46 total. So you can see those chromosomes are organized by size and numbered. So number 1 is your biggest chromosome, and then you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so on, all the way to 22, which should be your smallest chromosomes. Now, these are 2 separate chromosomes. That's why you don't see that X pattern. Remember, X pattern is just when they've been replicated or copied. So this 23 pairs would make for a total of 46 chromosomes. You have 22 that are considered autosomes, or your just regular chromosomes with all your regular genes. And then your very last pair is going to be your sex chromosomes. So that's either going to be XY if it's biologically male, or XX if it's biologically female. So these will eventually look like those classic X pattern when it's time to divide and we are replicating those chromosomes. So where are we getting these 46 chromosomes, these 23 pairs? So those 23 of those chromosomes, chromosome 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, so on, all the way to one of your X chromosomes, all come from your mother. So that egg cell has 23 chromosomes. It does not have 23 pairs. Remember, it's half the amount of DNA. Then 23, a 1 chromosome, a 2 chromosome, a 3 chromosome, a 4, all the way down, came from your father. And then he also donated for the sex chromosomes either a X chromosome if you're biologically female, or a Y chromosome if you are biologically male. And so each chromosome from your parents are going to match up to form a homologous pair. So you can see when you have 2 of the same chromosomes, one from mom, one from dad, those are a homologous pair. Greek homos means the same, and so these are the same chromosome with the exact same genes on them. When those chromosomes get duplicated in time for cell division or mitosis, they form that classic X because we've copied the exact same chromosome. So you can see all these homologous pairs in our karyotype or our map of our chromosomes here. So homologs are basically the same. They have all the same exact genes, but they're a little bit different because they may not contain the same alleles. So for example, here in our diagram, we have gene A. Dad donated a dominant form. Mom donated a recessive form. So you can see that the allele of the gene is slightly different. Here, both mom and dad contributed a dominant form, so it's the same. For gene C, you can see that, again, we have a dominant and a recessive, and so on. So it's important to understand that these homologs are the same chromosome number. They have the exact same genes on them, but they might have different information because they could have different alleles or different forms of that same gene. So when we're talking about what types of cells these are going to result in and whether or not they are going to be having 23 chromosomes or all 46, that's going to be whether they're a somatic cell or a sex cell. So most of the cells in your body are somatic cells. And somatic cell means just they have a diploid set of chromosomes or a full set of chromosomes, and that they are just all your regular tissues. Now, your sex cells, so either ovum or eggs and sperm, are called gametes. And gametes are going to use a special form of division called meiosis. So if you'll remember in mitosis, you start with one cell and you end up with 2 that are identical. With meiosis, we're going to start off with 1 and end up with 4 cells that are all unique or different, and they're all haploid, or they have half the amount of chromosomes. They only have one of each type of chromosome, so a total of 23 instead of 46 like you'd find in your somatic cells. So this word haploid means that you have one copy of each chromosome. You have no homologs, no homologous chromosomes. If you're diploid, you have two copies of each chromosome. So you would have homologous chromosomes, so like one from mom, one from dad. The shorthand for this is if it's haploid, we write that as the letter N. So that's how many, N is representing how many pairs of chromosomes you have. And then diploid is 2N because you have pairs of chromosomes instead of just one copy of each chromosome. Once we have those haploid sperm and those haploid eggs, those are going to fuse to again form a diploid zygote. So in order to make new people, you are going to go through meiosis to make haploid gametes. Those gametes will meet and fertilize and fuse to form a diploid zygote, which will grow into a diploid person that may then make sex cells that are haploid to begin this process all over again. Now, is this how it works in all eukaryotic cells that or organisms that participate in sex? No. Let's take a look at plants. So plants have an interesting form of their life cycle called the alternation of generations. So diploid individuals are going to undergo meiosis, just like we do, making those sperm and eggs. But instead of those haploid cells fusing together, they are actually going to start dividing to form a larger haploid individual. Now, these aren't going to be like a giant tree. They're going to be pretty small, but these haploid individuals are going to produce gametes that will then fertilize into a diploid zygote that can then form a full adult plant. So the reason it's called alternation of generations is because you've got two separate generations here. You have the diploid adult, and then you have the haploid individual that is going to produce those gametes that will then fuse. So an additional step taken in plants, which is pretty cool. All right, come back next time and we'll do 10.3.